I have had some men who do not feel the feeling, and the most they can feel is a bodily sensation. These men's ability to identify and describe their emotions was interrupted when they were very young.
Today, we have an extraordinary guest joining us. Dr. Ronald Levant, a trailblazer in the field of psychology, former president of the American Psychological Association, and author of The Problem with Men. Dr. Levant brings decades of expertise and a deeply personal story that transformed his life and career.
Masculinity really is a set of expectations, social expectations or social norms, if you will, for how boys and men are expected to think, feel, and behave. Being social norms, they're embedded in culture and historical era.
In this episode, we delve into topics like emotional inexpressiveness in men, its origins in societal norms, and how it profoundly affects relationships, mental health, and well-being.
With 6 or 8 guys in the room, I might get 30 words approximately. 20 of those words would be expressions of anger, furious, pissed off, burned, and 8 would not be emotions at all, but would be signs of stress, like burdened and zapped and stressed out. This idea that we prevent boys from crying and we also prevent them from expressing all kinds of emotions leads to a significant problem for men, which is emotional inexpressiveness. One of the things I've lately been thinking about is how all of our theories of depression and its treatment are probably wrong. The concept of a brain reset is really what we need to think about.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin. Hello, and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and I'm here with a really special guest. I'm talking to Dr. Ronald Levant. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Akron in Ohio, and he's a past president of both the APA in general, which is the American Psychological Association, and the specific division, number 51, that works with men and masculinities. He's a really esteemed guest, and I'm excited to have you on the show to talk about how the conversation around men is kind of going down in academic settings at the highest level. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So we always like to start the show with a little bit of bio, learning about you, how you got into this work. So can you let the listeners know, what inspired you to research men and masculinities?
Yes. My motivation for doing this was to understand problematic men. Because my personal biography is that I was physically abused by my father from about the age of 2. I was bullied by anti-Semitic bullies from about the age of 5. And as happens with such children, I became a juvenile delinquent. I was arrested. I ran away from home. I was kicked out of high school. And how did I get from there to the accolades that you described? So I actually have the answer to that. My new book called The Problem with Men, which is on Amazon, is my memoir. It's memoir self-help because after each chapter, I have takeaway lessons. What can you learn from my experience? So I'm really speaking to people who might be struggling as I did and trying to offer inspiration. As one of my endorsers, a former student, Shana Pryor, said, read this book if you feel like you've made too many mistakes in your life to be something amazing.
Ooh, that's really compelling. It's like this idea of kind of getting back on the horse and making the best of a bad situation. Well, so, we have a lot of life to cover and we only have an hour, but I guess the question that I want to start off with is, was there a rock bottom moment for you, or was there a moment where you start to turn things around, like you said, kind of coming from that trauma background and, being bullied with anti-Semitism, which is awful. I'm also Jewish, so I experienced my version of that. Was there a moment that you had to turn it around, or a moment of inspiration?
Well, there was both, and they happened at different times. The moment that kind of what I call the turning point in my life happened just after graduation from high school. And I was sitting around looking at brochures for different branches of the military, thinking I'd join. And a friend came by, and he's asked me to accompany him to an admissions test at Los Angeles City College. And I was not thinking about college at all, but I understood my buddy, kind of wanted some support. So I went along, and I'm not going to sit there for an hour, twiddling my thumbs. So I took the test too, got in, and for the first time in my life, first of all, was encouraged in academics. I never had been. Neither of my parents attended college. My father only had an 8th grade education. And secondly, I discovered I was really good at something. I was really good at math, it turned out. And I had no idea. So that was like turning point number one. But the darkest hour of my life occurred in my 20s. I was married early, became a father early at 20 and 21, respectively, and got into medical school and kind of crashed and burned, and suffered what I would call, as a clinical psychologist now, I would diagnose as a major depressive disorder. And I was actively suicidal. In one of my chapters, I describe my attempt to end my life by walking into traffic on a very busy street, which fortunately didn't happen, but I did it. And so that was kind of the bottom. And what was amazing, I was living in San Francisco at the time and availed myself of all kinds of therapeutic resources, none of which seemed to help. Medications, group therapy, day treatment, individual, nothing seemed to help until I took my first LSD trip. And my brother had gotten a hold of some double-barreled Ausleys. Ausley was the chemist who developed the purest version of LSD. And I took that LSD and had what we would call an amazing trip. But the most amazing thing is when I woke up, my depression was gone, and it had been sticking to me for about 18 months. I mean, I went to bed depressed, I woke up depressed, I walked through the day depressed, and it was like that for about 18 months, every single day. And miraculously, and now we know, I mean, actually, there are clinical trials going on with psilocybin, which is related to LSD, for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So I was an early patient, in an unscientific study that basically found what we're now finding in scientific studies, that psychedelics I had very loose supervision, but under proper supervision now can, snap people out of, just unremitting mental illnesses.
Yeah, it's really crazy how powerful they are. We've had a number of psychedelic experts on this show to talk about just that. Similar to you, I've used my fair share in my youth and have recently used some psilocybin to combat depression and things like that on about a yearly basis. But it is something that is like, I hope gets more study, and I hope really can see what happened there. I'm curious if you could think back, did you have any, was it the experience itself of taking the LSD? Was there something in the trip that kind of shook you out of it? Or was it what other people, I think, describe as kind of the brain reset, almost a physiological thing that happened for you?
The latter. I mean, the trip started off with the Grateful Dead's Anthem of the Dead and me looking at the album cover
Yes,
and listening to the music, and my brother and his friends cooking up an Indian feast, with butter chicken and, vindaloo and all kinds of different good Indian. And we were at a cabin in Santa Cruz woods, and it was just a great setting, great evening, and I just enjoyed myself more than I probably ever had in my life. And I was not expecting that it would have any effect on my depression, and just was surprised that, I went to sleep probably around 4 or 5 in the morning and woke up probably around noon, and I wasn't depressed. It's like the first time in 18 months. And so that's kind of how I experienced it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, I've had similar experiences with that, or MDMA as well, as like realizing that there is another possibility, right? My brain doesn't have to feel this way, and life doesn't have to feel that way. And it seems like once the brain can actually have that visceral experience, it tends to orient towards health, and happiness and being more vital. But I think we need those shakeups in order to, kind of get out of the stuckness that we can be in.
Yeah, one of the things I've lately been thinking about is how all of our theories of like depression and its treatment are probably wrong. And, I think the concept of a brain reset is really what we need to think about. Like, without using chemicals, is there a way that we could engineer a patient to experience a brain reset through some sort of talk therapy? And I haven't gotten very far with the idea, but it has occurred to me that, it does really challenge, because most of our therapies involve a lot of work on the part of the patient. I don't know if, like cognitive behavioral therapy, it really is a lot of work. You've got to monitor your thoughts. You've got to rebut the negative thoughts. You have to spend a fair amount of time every single day working on it, and it could take months. And as far as I can tell, the more effective antidepressant medications, the SSRIs and the SNRIs, don't always work, and they also create other problems. So I'm wondering if there isn't a more psychological way of doing what these chemicals do, of essentially a brain reset. And I haven't gotten very far with the idea, but it's just something I'll throw out there.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think about, because when you talk about that, my mind goes to initiation, right? And initiation rituals and things that young men in other cultures go through, right? This idea of, proving themselves to themselves is what I talk about a lot on this show, and what I do in my practice of, overcoming something really challenging, or being in a space where maybe experiencing group therapy for the first time and being held by other dudes, right? Or, having an altered state without it being drug induced, right? Maybe using masks or drums or dancing or things like that. And I've seen that work powerfully on men, both young and old, of any age. But that's where my mind goes to when I think of reset, is almost like a ritual, ceremonial, initiatory experience where guys are really transported like out of their life, right, into a ritual space, and then are able to reintegrate. I'm curious what you think of that, or come across those in your studies and research over.
I haven't, but you've. I'm going to put it on my agenda to look into that. But you did ask me a question of how did I get to the study of men, and maybe we ought to talk about what we study when we study men.
Yeah.
It's really. I'd like to make a distinction between men and masculinity. Because being men is just a biological fact. And, 97, 98% of the world are either men or women, and then there's a small percentage that intersect. And, of course, there are people who change their gender identity, but that's different than sex. Sex is kind of this bimodal thing, largely. But masculinity is something else entirely, and the two get confused. Masculinity really is a set of expectations, social expectations, or social norms, if you will, for how boys and men are expected to think, feel, and behave. And these being social norms, they're embedded in culture and historical era. And if we have time, I can give examples of how differently masculinity was conceived, in other times in this country or in other cultures. I'll just give one example, just so I'll just anchor it. But one masculine norm right now is men are not supposed to hug and kiss each other. I'm just talking about straight men, obviously. But in Abraham Lincoln's time, the norm was the exact opposite. Men did hug and kiss, and when they traveled to see each other, and remember, in the mid 1800s, it wasn't like getting in your Lexus and getting on the expressway. a horse and carriage or a train or something like that. So traveling was difficult then. If somebody's going from New York to Ohio, it was a trek. And they would plan to spend a few nights, and the visitor would spend the night in the bed of the man he came to visit. So men were in the mid 1800s were much more physically intimate and also verbally intimate with each other than the current norm is today. And then there's another norm today, which is restrictive emotionality, but this varies a lot in different cultures. In sort of the British Isles, it's very strict. It's a stiff upper lip and you really don't show what you're feeling. But if you go down to Italy or Greece, men are very expressive, very emotionally expressive. So I got to get rid of this cough. So that's just to illustrate that masculinity is, in a sense, arbitrary. And yet, why do I even raise this? I raise this because most boys learn when they're very young that conforming to masculine norms is obligatory. And here I'm talking about the United States now in the 2020s. And I have evidence that this still exists from a paper that was published in 2019. So, boys, when I grew up in the 1940s, we knew that the worst thing you could do was walk, talk, act, or throw like a girl. That's still the case. That is still the case. I grew up in the 1940s. I'm talking about the 2020s. Isn't that phenomenal? And that is a problematic norm because it essentially requires boys to renounce valuable human qualities that girls tend to express, such as emotional self-awareness, emotional expression, compassion, empathy, using conversation to settle disputes rather than your fists, and deepening relationships by revealing vulnerabilities. These are all things that boys learn are off limits, but just saying them, you can see how that handicaps boys in so many ways. And the whole thing about emotional expression, boys don't cry and all this stuff. Let's talk about that for a minute. So children of any sex have tear ducts, or humans of any sex have tear ducts, right? So why one sex can't cry and another sex can? And the other thing we know is that crying relieves sadness, partly by releasing a hormone, oxytocin, that makes you feel better. And finally, let me ask you if you know, what is the shortest sentence in the New Testament Bible? Jesus wept. I know neither of us are Christian, but I just brought that in. But it's most of your readers might be Christian, or your audience, I should say. But so this idea that we prevent boys from crying and we also prevent them from expressing all kinds of emotions leads to a significant problem for men, which is emotional inexpressiveness. You said I could mention the scientific name, so I'll quickly do that. It's normative male alexithymia. Alexithymia literally means without words for emotions. And I say normative because of the influence of masculine norms, particularly the norm of restrictive emotionality. And this is a huge problem for men. We don't have good prevalence studies in the U.S. I mean, there's a clinical tool to identify people who are alexithymic, and it was used in Finland, and 17% of men and 10% of women were considered alexithymic. But I can tell you, whenever I give a in-person lecture where I can actually see people, I ask them the question, how many of you know a man who, when you ask him, can't tell you what he's feeling? Every hand goes up. Everybody knows at least somebody who can't do that. But then you might say, well, so what? That's just the way guys are. Well, I would say, yeah, what? It has significant implications for relationships, for stress management, and for health. Should I go on with this, or?
This is great. The curiosity I have is like, one, I guess I should back up. I agree. I see that all the time. Is just a lack of even just being able to grasp an emotion, which I think is not talked about enough. And I think it's great that you're bringing this onto the show because, when you ask a guy, even in therapy, hey, how do you feel? Most of the time they're like, I don't know. It's like literally like going into a void. And I think it makes a lot of dudes bounce off of psychotherapy and talk therapy because they can't quite do it, and they need more of an education around what emotions are and what they physically, somatically feel like in order to be able to even engage with the industry, just to begin with, but
exactly.
I'm curious for you, like, how did we get here? Because when you think of like 1800s America and you're thinking like the stereotype of like the gruff Wild West, and like where America was like hard and we're like doing all this stuff. And then you have these men that are more emotional, more intimate, more physical, and you look at other countries and all through history, you look at like medieval times and the men that, are dressed in like, frilly clothes and they're dandies and art and music are the, top of the game. Like, how did our culture, Western culture and maybe American culture in particular, get so restrictive, and get so fragile as well, just very one note?
Well, there is a book by E. Anthony Rotundo called A History of American Manhood, which, can kind of, from the revolution to the present era. But kind of I can't kind of summarize the book in a short amount of time. But I would say it's really the post-war era and the culture of the 50s, dominated by, these macho figures like John Wayne. You want some trouble, Pilgrim? That's the best I can do with my John Wayne imitation. Forget it. I'll take it. Yeah. But it was, and of course, my perspective is I was born in 1942, so I came of age. I not came of age, but I grew up through the 40s and 50s, and this type of model of being a boy and being a man was dominant. So, kind of the way I dealt with the bullying was I was about 9, I think. I joined the YMCA and took a boxing class. And then my uncle, who kind of didn't know but suspected I'd been getting beat up, he bought me a set of weights, with a bar and some plates. And then I bought myself, because I was mowing lawns at that time, making money, I bought myself a speed bag. So I learned how to fight. And then the next time, it was usually a gang of 4 or 5 boys, and they'd ambush you, and they'd say, "There's the kike, let's get him." And this one boy stepped up and ready to fight. So I got into my boxing, stance, and they're laughing at me, right? And I go, pow, pow, pow. And the kid's on the ground in 3 punches.
Oh, yeah. I love that story.
So I bought into that. It was basically survival. And it was part of my delinquency was being kind of a hood, being a tough guy. And I'm not proud of it. That's just the way it, as an adult, I obviously would choose different. But as a boy, that's kind of, sort of how I what I did. My father really troubled me because he was, really just an obnoxious person. He only had an 8th grade education. He became a self-made man. He learned a trade. He was in the Seabees during World War II, the construction battalion, and he learned the trade of printing. And so he became a pressman. And then he rode that for, scrimping and saving to become a small businessman operating a small printing press. But anyway, he was so disagreeable. He would fart loudly among family and friends. He would scream at my mother during family gatherings like, "Shut up, Billy!" That's his voice. It's in my head, unfortunately. And, you know, and he was horrible with me. I mean, I'll tell you one incident where I was probably in about the 4th grade or 5th grade, and I was into building these model airplanes, those balsa wood model airplanes. And I had just finished the structure. I hadn't put the skin on, you know, the thin tissue paper, and I hung it up on above my bed with a hook. And then I settled down. Oh, and my uncle had bought me a shortwave radio, which was my prized possession as a Grundig Majestic short. And I was able from Los Angeles to get a station in Memphis that ran the Johnny Otis show, the first rhythm and blues show. And so I would rock out listening to Johnny Otis and make my model airplanes. And my father, I heard this loud stomping down that we lived in a very small house, about 1,100 square feet, 3-bedroom, 1 bath. It was like one of those tract homes that sprouted up after the end of the war when they had this veterans loan program of some kind. And so he's running down the hall, and he says, "God damn it, Ronnie." And he comes into my bedroom, and he grabs the airplane off the wall, smashes it, and then he picks up the radio, and he's going to throw it at me, and I hit the deck, and it goes through the window, crashes and smashes. That's my dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, when I through a very long story that's not necessary to go into, but, you know, I went to Berkeley. I went from LA City College to Berkeley, which is a huge jump, and went to medical school, got into all this, psychological problems, then went back, decided I wanted to become a clinical psychologist. At that time, it was harder to get into a doctoral program in clinical psych than medical school, so I knew I had to go back and take the major. So I went back to Berkeley for a year just to take the major in psychology, and then I got into Harvard, so I did pretty well, and was in their clinical psychology program, and got out in record time, and my first faculty job was at Boston University, and I started focusing on fathers, partly because I was a divorced semi-custodial father, and I wanted to understand my role better, but also because I was aware that dads, and I know you have a lot of dads in your audience, you know, don't get a lot of support. And they, particularly, you know, parent education is not geared for men. You know, parent ed classes are 100% women, or at least they were at the time. That may have changed. But this was in the 1980s, early 1980s. And so I had a graduate student who was also, he and I were training for the Boston Marathon. So we spent a lot of time together on 15-mile runs and things like that. And we were talking about, well, what would you do if you wanted to educate men about being a parent? We kind of would have these long chats about things we would put into a program. And through a combination of very fortunate circumstances, I got to, Greg did his dissertation on this idea, but I got to open up something called the BU Fatherhood Project that offered father education for men. And I'll even show you. Yeah, these are some of our original books.
Yeah, cool.
Parent Education for Fathers.
Yeah, yeah.
So we were kind of doing this, and the other thing that was kind of a gas about this is I got a grant that was large at the time. It was like $35,000. I spent almost all of it on video equipment. Because in the early 1980s, video equipment was very cool. So I had more video equipment than any sane human would ever want.
Awesome.
Yeah. And we would, and we used it. It was all part of the thing that we would role play and videotape the interaction and then play it back and, and identify problematic things and talk about them. And it also was impressive to the guys when they came into the room. They'd see all this equipment and they'd say, these guys must have it going on. Look at all this stuff. And we told them, we'll teach them how to be a better dad the same way they might have learned a sport like golf or tennis. We'll do it, we'll video it, we'll watch the replay, figure out how to make it better. So during one of these classes, I noticed one of the dads was out of sorts. He seemed moody. So I asked him, and this before I knew anything about men and emotions, so I said, Don, is something wrong? And he said, yeah, his son had stood him up for a father-son hockey game. So I said, wow, I'm sorry to hear that. How did that make you feel? Again, not knowing that he wasn't going to be able to tell me, but here was his answer. He shouldn't have done it. Raising his voice, pointing his finger. I said, I agree, Don, but still pursuing a stupid question. How did you feel? So I said, okay, let's role play. He couldn't answer, obviously. So I said, let's role play. You be you, and Tim, you be his ex-wife as she delivers the news to him that his son had forgotten about the date and had gone off with some friends. So we videotaped the interaction, and Don's shoulders falls into a slump, his face into a frown. We've captured it on the tape. We play it back. I'm sitting right next to him watching the tape, and I'm coaching him. And I'm saying, Don, look at the tape. Try to figure out how you were feeling. And he's going like this, scratching his chin and saying, I guess I must have felt disappointed. And I thought, I guess I must feel disappointed. That's all I can get after this much coaching? And I thought, how might a mother feel in an analogous situation?
Yeah.
Like a daughter standing her up for a shopping date. Well, at first I was hurt. No, at first I was surprised because it's not like her to do that. And then I was hurt that she acted with so little regard for my feelings. And then I was worried that maybe she was upset with me and this is her way of showing it. And then I wound up angry because my whole day was ruined. And I thought, I guess I must have felt disappointed, hurt, surprised, hurt, worried, annoyed. What's going on here? So I went back to my colleagues in the Department of Counseling Psych at BU, and I asked during a faculty meeting, I said, this weird thing happened to me. Do you guys have any ideas? And they all said, and it was probably 2/3 men, 1/3 women among the faculty. They said, Ron, women are just more emotional by nature. Get over it.
At the highest level, it just ends there. The conversation's just over.
This is a group of about 10 PhDs, right? Yeah. Professors. Yeah. So that didn't satisfy me. So I went back to the literature I was aware of the literature in developmental psychology called emotion socialization. It's a research literature. And what I found was interesting. I found that boys are more emotionally expressive than girls until about 2 years of age. As neonates, but neonates don't, they cry more frequently. That's all neonates cry and sleep. That's about all they do. But it also showed up in a study I found at 6 months of age, at 1 year of age, when babies will do a lot more. They'll coo and they'll giggle and they'll gesture toward the mother or they'll talk. And so, but then at 2, girls start to overtake boys by using more emotion words. And then between 4 and 6, a remarkable transformation takes place where boys lose their facial expressivity. So this was like a really ingenious study where the experimenter brought mothers with one of their children into the lab, and either a boy or girl, but they had to be between 4 and 6 years of age. and he showed the child emotionally stimulating slides, and the mother watched the child's face in a monitor in an adjacent room, and the question was, could she guess the slide shown to her child? Isn't that interesting? What he found was that at 4 years of age, the mothers of sons were equally accurate to mothers of daughters, but the mothers of sons grew increasingly less accurate until by the age of 6, there were significant differences. So you have to say, well, what's going on with boys between 4 and 6? Well, they're in preschool and elementary school. And what I was mentioning earlier, their behavior is being policed by their peers for conformity to masculine norms. They're being socialized. And, it's not cool to be emotionally expressive. It's not cool to have facial expression. You got to have that stiff upper lip, as we were mentioning earlier. So I thought that was awesome. And it also fit right in with my thinking at the time, because I was thinking about masculine norms. And I was thinking that boys who grow up socialized to conform to the norm of restrictive emotionality have an elevated risk for becoming alexithymic or emotionally inexpressive as adult men.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show. I love how you did the father coaching like a sports analogy.
Yeah.
You did instant replay, and you did the commentary and all that. I think that really works, because what I hear and what I experience time and time again, I think even now, our industry really, a lot of men bounce off of it. I think a lot of therapists are attached to the question, just like you brought up, of what are you feeling? Name a feeling, do the feeling. You're like, here's the words. If you don't do it, you're doing it wrong. I think a lot of therapists that are not as well trained, are kind of what I call validation therapists, where they're just agreeing or validating.
I didn't hear that word. I'm sorry.
Validation therapists, where they're just agreeing and, being like, oh, that's so hard. That's so difficult, empathizing. But what I see with my guys is they need challenge, and we need growth, and we need feedback, and we need a mirror. So I'm curious for you, what do you experience with men not really sticking with mental health work, or, having the ability to develop this emotional intelligence?
Well, I agree. You have to challenge them. The kind of thing I did, you really need a group to do. Definitely. It can't be done in individual therapy because you need, various people to play off, and it's very effective in groups. Mm-hmm. And if you have video equipment, and nowadays you can just use your phone. That's
right. You can roll back
$35,000 worth of equipment. Now you can get a $900 iPhone and videotape the whole thing. But what I do individually is once I've kind of figured out that my client may be alexithymic or emotionally inexpressive, is I work with them to develop emotional self-awareness and expressivity through a 4-step program. Mm-hmm. Should I go through the steps?
Yeah. Rattle them off. Okay. What are the 4 steps?
So one of the things I found, and literature has shown this, that men's vocabulary for emotions is impoverished. I'll give you an example. I used to do these growth groups before I did therapy groups, where one of the things I would do, I'd ask men to name emotions, give me words for emotions, and I'd write them up on a flip chart. This is before whiteboards, but these were just paper flip charts. And with 6 or 8 guys in the room, I might get 30 words approximately, and 20 of those words would be expressions of anger. Mm-hmm. Furious, pissed off, burned, just on and on and on. And 8 would not be emotions at all, but would be signs of stress, like burdened and zapped and stressed out. Those aren't emotions. Those are just feeling stressed. And then maybe 1 or 2 guys might come up with an actual word that describes an emotion like joy or fear. But I concluded from a lot of this that because of how boys are socialized, men's vocabulary for emotion words is relatively impoverished. So in individual therapy, I have a whole workbook on this stuff. I can show it to you later. Where why don't I show it to you?
Yeah, bring it up.
And this is actually I actually released 2 books this summer. One is my memoir, and the other one is this one called The Assessment and Treatment of Emotionally Inexpressive Men. And
Right.
so,
Yeah.
let's see here.
Throw that on the show notes as well.
So this is more for clinicians
Yep.
than for individual men.
Yeah, I know we have a lot of clinicians that listen to this too. So something good to check out and to like skill up around working with this, because it is unbelievably common. I see it with most of my guys of just not even having the language, vocabulary, awareness of what they're feeling, let alone what to do about it, other than what I think Dr. Levant is talking about, which is, get angry or retreat, kind of go into a fight or flight, mood, rather than actually expressing the emotion and working effectively.
I don't know if you can see this, how clear it's going to be.
Yeah.
We have the exercise over here
Okay.
where I asked them to come up during the course of the week to come up with as many words for emotions as they can.
Mm-hmm.
And I rely on men's competitiveness in this regard. And I'll say the last guy I saw came in with 30 words.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's good.
And I could be sure my guy's going to come in with 31.
Yeah, at least. Yeah. Like that.
It works every time. And so I have them just, kind of, and I also, in this book, I have a list of emotion words, but I have them kind of just think about words that describe emotion and build up the vocabulary. Then I found that helping men learn to identify emotions in other people is easier than learning to identify emotions in oneself.
Is it?
So I asked them, this would be the next assignment, to, during the course of the week when you're talking to somebody or just people watching or watching TV, and instead of just listening to the words, ask yourself the question, what is he or she feeling when they're saying this? And I teach them about the facial expression of emotions, about tone of voice, about paralinguistic things like sighs, cries, and gas, body language. So I give them some tools, and I say, okay, try to identify what people are feeling. So this serves 2 purposes. One, it helps them identify emotions in other people. The other one, it helps them develop what we call theory of mind. Are you familiar with that idea?
Yep. Yeah. It's like empathy, right? Basically, put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Right. Exactly. So, so that's step 2, and that usually takes a couple of weeks. The vocabulary you can do, and by the way, these fit into, like maybe take 10 minutes in a 50-minute session. So you can do whatever you're doing with your client, but you're working this in and you're giving homework. And it doesn't burden the therapy. If a guy's in crisis, you still have plenty of time to talk about, that issues that they might be experiencing during the week and things that are distressed about. But you're also giving them some tools, helping them build tools. Then the next step after they've learned to identify emotions in other people is to identify emotions in themselves. Now, many men will feel the emotion. I feel sad. I feel anxious. I feel angry. That one is easy for most men because that's permitted. But I have had some men who do not feel the feeling. They do not feel the feeling. And the most they can feel is a bodily sensation. These are more severely alexithymic men. So they might talk about a tight band across my forehead, or one of my clients described stiff neck, or butterflies in your stomach, or feeling my legs keep jiggling. So I say, okay, the emotion you're feeling or the bodily sensation that you're feeling right now, write it down. I give them, again, a little workbook. I won't bother trying to find it, but it's a little workbook where they can write it down. Write down the feeling or the bodily sensation. Then, who is doing what to whom right now, and how does that affect you?
Well,
Consider the social impact, and because most of us react to other people. Humans are very social animals. We live with other people, and our emotions are often induced by other people. So I ask them to, consider the social context and write it down, particularly how does it affect you? And then the third step is to go through their vocabulary list and pick out the word or words that describe what they're feeling. So here might be an example. Feeling butterflies in my stomach. Okay, that might be apprehension. The situation. I was expecting feedback on a progress report from my supervisor at 1 o'clock, and it's 1:30, and I haven't gotten it.
Oh, no.
That's the social context. Okay, what might you be feeling? I kind of jumped the shark and mentioned apprehensive, but that, if you go through the list, apprehensive, anxious, afraid, something like that. So, doing this helps men kind of develop the skills to kind of just put their emotions into words. And I realize this must sound to you, who's a psychotherapist and obviously very familiar with emotions, like very basic. But consider that these men's ability to identify and describe their emotions was interrupted when they were very young.
Oh, yeah.
So, we kind of have to go back to that very early stage and deal with it in very basic steps. I did a clinical trial of my alexithymia reduction treatment, which is ART for short. That's my little joke. I always like to put a joke in my stuff. Psychotherapy is more art than science is kind of the joke. But anyway, I am a scientist too. And so I did a clinical trial and found that it wasn't a randomized clinical trial, but it was comparing two groups, one receiving treatment as usual, another one receiving alexithymia reduction treatment. We found that, we measured alexithymia, we measured masculine norms. We found that the treatment group, as compared to the comparison group, reduced alexithymia, reduced some masculine norms, and provided evidence for continuing.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and I think the education is necessary because, like you said, many men didn't get this growing up, right? Especially if you look at men, I think, that are in like impoverished communities or communities that they didn't have fathers, right? Like they were just told, like, be angry. Basically, you can be angry, you can be happy, you can be horny, right? Those are kind of like the three male emotions that I talk about with my guys. Whereas like things like fear, joy, even, right? Like sadness, grief, disgust, loneliness. Yeah, not allowed. So I think they need that type of tool. And what I tell my guys is, with that, it's helpful because then you know what to do about it, right? Like you can't deal with a situation if you don't know what it is. And if everything is anger, right, and we're always just reacting in anger, it's not a joke that why we get, we're not affected in our lives, right? Our relationships fall apart. I'm curious for you, because when you talk about these men, right, like I see it kind of as the toxic masculine archetype, right? This kind of like bully, shut down, you said like John Wayne kind of guys. And I find that that's true for a lot of boomer generation, a lot of Gen Xers, I think too. But I work, with some younger clients, a lot of millennials and Gen Z. And what I see is almost the opposite. I see this kind of like nice guy syndrome, right? Where you have guys that they're not bullies. They're actually very nice. They're very accommodating. They're people pleasers. Even they might appear very emotional, have this emotional intelligence by being raised, I think, predominantly by women. But underneath it, they are actually angry, resentful, mad, lost, confused, right? There's like all this like darkness and depth underneath that. So I'm curious, one, if you see that in the work and research that you do, and two, if this changes based on the way that a man expresses himself, if he's more of that bully versus more of that nice guy, people pleaser.
Well, I have a couple of answers to your question, and one is, and this is going to be based in research I've done. I did study 4 cohorts of adults, not just men and women, on their adherence to masculinity ideology. That's the term we use. Basically, what it refers to as beliefs about, as I said earlier, beliefs about how boys and men should think, feel, and behave.
Yes.
So we administered several scales to a sample, a large sample. I think it was 1,500, ranging from 18 to 80. And then we separated them into cohorts, and we did a very rigorous step first that I won't go into much detail, which is we wanted to, when you're comparing groups, whether it's based on age, race, sexual orientation, you want to make sure that the participants in each group understand the scale in the same way as the other group. That's very important. It's not to be assumed. And there's a technique using what's called structural equation modeling for doing this. It's called the assessment of measurement invariance. So we went through all that. I won't bore your readers with it. And then we showed that it was invariant, that all cohorts understood the scale in the same way. And then we found that basically people had the masculinity ideology that they came of age with. The boomers, the older cohort, was very, very traditional. And then successive cohorts, so as older adults, middle-aged adults, established adults, and then young adults. Those were the categories. Those are like the categories in psychology that are used to characterize adulthood. And we found that they were different. They were significantly different. And as you got younger, the attitudes were more liberal, less adherent to these norms. So that kind of speaks a little bit to what you're saying.
Certainly.
We didn't specifically focus on Gen Z or any, it's like it was doing these categories that I mentioned, but it lines up with what you were saying. That the younger folks, and these were men and women. And the reason for men and women is because everybody has attitudes about what, or opinions about how boys and men should think, feel, and behave. Everybody, regardless of what gender or sex, gender identity or sex they are, we all have opinions. And it was fascinating that these opinions varied by cohort, significantly by cohort. So
where do you see them moving? Like in what directions were they moving?
Away from endorsing the norms. As they got younger, they endorsed them less. Yeah. And then the second answer to your question, one of my graduate students did a study, and it was a very thorough study. I think she did it for her did part of it for her master's thesis and part of her dissertation, where she started off with focus groups, and she wanted to see if there was what was the masculinity ideology of young adults at the time that she did the study. And I think young adults are defined up through 29. Yeah, something like that. 29, and 30 becomes established adult. Okay. So 18 to 29. And so she did focus groups. She generated questions, which are basically statements that you ask people how much they agree or disagree with. And then she administered it to a sample. She did what we call an exploratory factor analysis. Then she got another sample and did a confirmatory factor analysis. And all of that came to naught. They had a couple of scales in there that she had gotten from the focus groups that she thought would differentiate young adults from older adults. One was called situational flexibility. Now, rigidity is a part of adhering to masculine norms. the men who adhere to him, they adhere to him rigidly. There's no give or take. You probably know men like this. I mean, it's, and so she had a scale called SITFlex, situational flexibility. And when we did the structural equation modeling, it fell apart, unfortunately. And she had a couple of other scales that were reflective of a more nuanced way of being a man, and they all fell apart. So unfortunately, even though we found in the cohort study that younger adults, do not endorse these norms as much as older adults, when we tried to develop a scale to capture what they do believe, we failed. We failed. We couldn't do it. It just didn't differentiate. It was the same scale.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because, and I just had this thought. I'm curious what you think about this, right? Like, because when you talk about that, we'll call it toxic masculinity or whatever, right? Traditional masculinity. What you brought up too, it's like anti-femininity, right? It's like they don't really know what they are, but they know they're not women. And I think that's a very fragile personality structure because, it doesn't have a core. It's just a reaction to something else, right? But if I'm hearing you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm hearing what you found is that the younger generations are anti-traditional masculinity, but they also don't have their own core either. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't say completely that they're anti. It's just that they endorse it much less strongly. They still endorse it, but much less strongly. And they don't endorse all the norms.
Yeah.
Like one norm that's kind of fallen out, particularly among younger generations, that was strong in the older group, is antipathy toward gay and bisexual men. That's a masculine norm because, gay and bisexual men are thought to be feminine. And if you have to avoid all things feminine, well, what are you going to do with these men, right? You're going to have to reject them. And that changed. And I think that reflects not so much a change in masculinity as a change in culture, after the gay marriage decision by the Supreme Court. I think society as a whole, in a very short space of time, completely changed attitude. Not completely, I'm sorry. There's segments of our society like Robinson, the candidate for governor in North Carolina. I don't know if you know about him, but he's a homophobe to beat homophobes. Yeah. Except when he's watching homoerotic pornography. Wow.
Internalized trauma.
That's a contradiction I want him to explain. Yeah. But I think American society, and probably even in Western Europe, became much less homophobic after that decision. And you'd have to agree. And the other part of it is, I think practically everybody knows somebody who's gay. And maybe in their family. I have two or three people in my family, or friends or coworkers. So when they're in your social life, you know them, you interact with them, you work with them, they're people just like you, struggling just like you. They're just normal people. It's hard to have this prejudice against them.
Right, because there's a real connection. There's actually integration now, and they're not being objectified and pushed away. So
the other thing that's changed, I'm just going to mention, the other thing that's changed, but older generation, younger generation, and it happened kind of probably among the group that's middle-aged now, is fathering. Back in the 60s, we used to do these time diary studies where you'd ask parents to fill out diaries every 15 minutes. What are you doing? I can imagine, I'm filling out this damn survey.
Right. Sitting down, I'm not doing what I want to do. I'm doing this thing for this doctor. I'm pissed.
But anyway, it was the way we did research back in the 60s. Yeah. And we found that fathers increased their involvement in childcare in response to their wives' employment. And remember, in the 60s, women were just starting to move into the workforce. It started in the 50s and it really erupted by the 80s. But they increased the amount of time they spent with their kids, and if their wives were employed, guess how much time a day they increased? What would you guess, Mark?
If the wives were employed, it's probably way lower. I think it is. I'd say 2 or 3 hours.
6 minutes.
6 minutes, way lower than I think it is. Okay. Yeah. That's crazy. That's crazy.
And, I mean,
And that's so progressive for the time, right?
I don't know. I mean, I was, aware and alive and all that. And I just didn't, during the 60s, I just didn't, it just didn't register with me. I mean, I was a very young father, and my wife and I were still students at the time. And so we had to kind of schedule caring for our daughter. And you're going to go to class. Okay, I'll take care of Karen. Her name was Karen, this, that, and the other thing. And so because of necessity, I was an active parent. So it didn't really apply to me. I was much more than 6 minutes a day. But this was in general, and many of the men in the study weren't students like we were, kind of struggling to kind of just make ends meet and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we started the Fatherhood Project, part of the impetus was seeing visible evidence. Like in 82, you started to see men in Harvard Square carrying infants in snuggly packs, those chest packs, or pushing strollers, and it was like new, and you hadn't seen that before, and so the father's role has definitely changed. Attitudes towards gay and bisexual men has definitely changed. Restrictive emotionally, not so much.
Okay.
I was talking about some of the problems with restrictive emotionality. Do we have time to do that?
Oh, we're nearing the end, but I'd love to have you back on for another show.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I guess the last question, the last question I do want to ask you, though, is, if a guy's listening to this podcast and he is relating with what you're saying, if he feels that he's restricted, if he feels like he doesn't have language for what he's doing, how can he start? How can he start to open up his aperture and broaden his emotional experience?
Unfortunately, I don't have a book written for the general public on this topic. I have one that's early that I think was a precursor of this. It's called Masculinity Reconstructed, and it really talks about the groups I ran with men, and I have some of this in there. The other obvious answer is to go to a therapist or counselor who can help them. The counselor could buy my book and use the method. I mean, it's all out there. The assessment and treatment of emotionally inexpressive men. I do need to write a book for the general public about how to do this, and I haven't. I probably need to sit down and think about how I could do that, because I've got 2 books in the queue right now.
Nice. Well, yeah, coming soon. I'll certainly have you back on the show, I think, to talk more about this. And there's a fascinating conversation. I have a ton of questions that unfortunately we didn't get a chance to get to, but I'd love to.
We'll come back. We'll have round 2.
Yeah, exactly. And just see kind of what conversations are happening at the academic level. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to learn more about you or find you online, where can they look you up?
Well, Facebook and Instagram. I'll give you the links, and you can put them in the podcast notes or what have you. And I have a website on one of my earlier books. Actually, that book might be helpful. It's called The Tough Standard. I'll put a link to that and to Facebook and Instagram, and those would be 3 ways that they could connect with me.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'll have all that stuff in the show notes, as well as Amazon links for all of his books. If you want to check it out, learn, whether you're, in the general public or a clinician, or is interested in being a better parent or a better partner to a man, right? Like learning a little bit about what goes on inside of our head by someone who's been in this field for a while and really knows what they're talking about. So Dr. Levant, thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. I just wanted a quick reminder, we do a video version of the podcast now, so check us out on YouTube. We're putting out shorts on YouTube as well as Instagram and Facebook. So we're really getting out there, spreading the word to guys. So if you benefit from this, please share it with somebody else, a guy that might be emotionally restrictive or might be inspired by some of the words that you heard here today. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.